She was 10 years old when the English first arrived. 10. Not the voluptuous young woman with a 20-inch waist that Disney would later conjure from the American imagination. Not the romantic heroine choosing between duty and desire. Not the willing bridge between civilizations. She was a child named Matoaka. And what happened to her is one of the most deliberately obscured crimes in American colonial history. The story you know. The story of Pocahontas saving John Smith, falling in love, and bringing peace between her people and the English is a carefully constructed lie designed to make colonization look like cooperation, to make kidnapping look like romance, and to make cultural genocide look like willing conversion. The truth is darker, more violent, and more critical than the fairy tale we've been sold. This is the story of a girl who was kidnapped, held hostage, forcibly converted, married off to her captor's associate, paraded through England as proof of successful colonization, and died trying to escape back home. This is the story Disney will never tell you. Let's start with who she actually was, because even her name has been stolen and sanitized. She was born around 1596 as Matoaka, daughter of Powhatan, paramount chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, in what the English would name Virginia. Pocahontas was a nickname, possibly meaning playful one or ill-behaved child, not her real name. Among her people, your proper name held power and wasn't shared casually with outsiders. The fact that English records only use her childhood nickname tells you something about how little the colonizers cared about Powhatan customs or dignity. They never bothered to learn her real name, or if they did, they never recorded it, because to them, she wasn't a whole person with an identity worthy of respect. She was a tool, a symbol, a commodity to be used for English purposes. Her father, Powhatan, ruled over approximately 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes, totaling about 15,000 people across the Tidewater region of Virginia. This wasn't a primitive society waiting for European civilization to arrive. This was a complex political confederation with sophisticated agriculture, extensive trade networks, spiritual practices, legal systems, and diplomatic protocols. When the English arrived in 1607 and established Jamestown, they were entering Powhatan's territory without permission, squatting on land that belonged to the Paspahegh people, one of the Confederacy's member tribes. The English didn't see it that way, of course. They had a charter from King James claiming all this land for England, as if a piece of paper written in London could negate the reality of thousands of people who'd lived there for centuries. But that's colonialism in a nutshell. Your claim to the land doesn't matter unless you have the military power and cultural arrogance to enforce it. Powhatan's initial response to the Jamestown settlement was cautious, strategic calculation. These English weren't the first Europeans his people had encountered. Spanish expeditions had come and gone, usually violently. The Powhatan understood that these pale strangers had powerful weapons, metal tools worth trading for, and a tendency toward unpredictable aggression. Powhatan decided on a strategy of contained engagement, allow limited trade, maintain surveillance, prevent the English from expanding beyond their initial settlement, and wait to see if they'd die off, as had happened with earlier attempts at European colonization in the region. It was a reasonable strategy. The English were incompetent at survival in this environment, constantly on the brink of starvation despite being surrounded by abundant resources they didn't know how to exploit. This is where John Smith enters the story, and we need to talk about him honestly because he's the other half of the Disney lie. Smith was a professional soldier and self-promoter, a man who'd spent years fighting in various European wars and had a documented history of exaggerating his own importance. When he was captured by Powhatan's warriors in December 1607 while exploring up the Chickahominy River, he was treated according to Powhatan diplomatic protocol. Interrogated, assessed as a potential threat or asset, and eventually released with messages for the other English. This was standard procedure for dealing with foreign leaders, and the Powhatan correctly identified Smith as someone important in the English hierarchy despite his relatively low official rank. Here's where the famous rescue supposedly happened, and here's why it's almost certainly fabricated. Smith's first account of his capture, written in 1608, mentions nothing about being saved by Powhatan's daughter. Nothing. He describes being well treated, fed bountifully, and released after discussions with Powhatan. The rescue story doesn't appear until 1624, 17 years later, in Smith's General History of Virginia, written after Pocahontas was already dead and couldn't contradict his version. Even more tellingly, this wasn't the first time Smith claimed to have been rescued by an exotic princess. He told similar stories about his adventures in Turkey and other locations. It was his narrative signature, the romantic element he added to make his adventures more marketable to English readers. But let's say something did happen. Some interaction between young Matoaka and the captured English captain. What would it have been? If Powhatan staged an execution ceremony that was interrupted, it was likely a ritual adoption ceremony, a diplomatic theater designed to demonstrate Powhatan's power and then his mercy, incorporating Smith into a subordinate relationship within the Confederacy's political structure. The young girl's role, if she had one, would have been ceremonial, scripted by her father for specific diplomatic purposes. This wasn't romance. This wasn't even a child's independent choice to save a man she felt sorry for. This was, at most, a child participating in an adult political ritual she probably didn't fully understand. What we know for certain is that after Smith's release, there was a period of uneasy trade and periodic violence between Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy. Matoaka sometimes visited the English settlement as part of trade delegations. She was a child, maybe 11 or 12 years old during this period, and English accounts describe her cartwheeling naked through the fort with Powhatan boys, behavior that tells you exactly how young and unself-conscious she was. The fact that these Englishmen recorded a child's nakedness without apparent concern also tells you something about the era's different cultural standards. But it should absolutely destroy any notion that there was a romantic relationship between Pocahontas and John Smith. She was a child. He was a grown man. Any suggestion of romance is retroactive fantasy. Smith left Virginia in 1609 after being injured in a gunpowder explosion, and Pocahontas dropped almost entirely from English records for the next 4 years. She would have been entering adolescence during this period, and based on Powhatan customs, she probably married a warrior named Kocoum around 1610. English sources barely mention this marriage, and later colonial narratives tried to erase it, because acknowledging that Pocahontas was already married when the English kidnapped her makes what happened next even more clearly criminal. She wasn't an available maiden waiting for an English husband. She was a married woman living with her people, raising what may have been a young child, going about her life away from the increasingly hostile English settlement. By 1610, the relationship between Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy had deteriorated into open warfare. The English had abandoned any pretense of being peaceful traders. They were raiding Powhatan villages for food, burning corn stores, killing men, women, and children, and making it clear they intended to take the land by force. Powhatan responded by laying siege to Jamestown, cutting off English access to food and water from outside the fort. The English response was genocidal violence led by men like Thomas Dale and Thomas Gates, military governors who waged systematic warfare against the Powhatan with a brutality that shocked even some of their own colonists. Into this context of escalating violence comes Captain Samuel Argall, an English privateer and trader who'd been working the Potomac River area north of Jamestown. In April 1613, Argall learned that Pocahontas was staying with the Patawamak people, a tribe on the margins of the Powhatan Confederacy who were trying to maintain neutrality and trade with both sides. Argall immediately recognized her value as a hostage. If he could capture Powhatan's daughter, he could use her to extort concessions, return of English prisoners, return of English weapons the Powhatan had captured, and most importantly, a steady supply of corn to feed the starving colony. So he kidnapped her. The details are somewhat murky because English sources tried to make it seem less like a kidnapping and more like a negotiated arrangement. The story they told was that Argall convinced a Patawomek chief named Iopacis and his wife to lure Pocahontas onto Argall's ship, where she was then detained. Iopacis supposedly did this in exchange for a copper kettle. Whether that's exactly how it happened, or whether Argall simply grabbed her by force and invented the story to implicate the Patawomek, we'll never know for certain. What matters is the result. Pocahontas was taken prisoner and transported to Jamestown. She was approximately 17 years old. She was married. She may have had a young child, and she'd just been kidnapped by foreign invaders who were at war with her people. The English immediately sent word to Powhatan that they held his daughter hostage and laid out their demands. They wanted English prisoners returned, English weapons returned, and an ample supply of corn. Powhatan's response reveals the complicated reality of indigenous politics that English sources preferred to obscure. He sent back a few prisoners and some old weapons, but not the full ransom demanded. English chroniclers portrayed this as evidence that Powhatan didn't value his daughter, but that's almost certainly a misreading. Powhatan had multiple children from multiple wives. Prioritizing one daughter's safety over the political and military interests of the entire Confederacy would have been irresponsible leadership. He was also likely calculating, correctly, that the English wouldn't actually kill her because she was more valuable alive as a hostage and propaganda tool than dead as a martyr. So Pocahontas remained imprisoned. Initially, she was held at Jamestown and then moved to a settlement called Henrico, further up the James River, under the custody of Thomas Dale. And this is where the narrative gets deliberately obscured by English sources, because what happened during her captivity is glossed over with euphemisms about religious instruction and civilizing education. Let's be clear about what we're describing. A teenage girl held prisoner by foreign men, cut off from her family and community, with absolutely no power or agency over her situation. The English assigned a minister named Alexander Whitaker to convert her to Christianity. They changed her manner of dress to English clothing. They forced her to learn English customs and manners. They gave her a new Christian name, Rebecca. Colonial propaganda would later frame this as Pocahontas willingly embracing civilization and true religion, but it's crucial to understand that she had no choice in any of this. She was a prisoner. Her captors controlled every aspect of her life. Any compliance with their demands was coerced, not freely given. This wasn't a religious conversion. This was a cultural assault under conditions of captivity. And then there's John Rolfe. Rolfe was a colonist who'd arrived in Virginia in 1610 with his first wife, who died shortly after arrival. He was obsessed with perfecting tobacco cultivation, experimenting with Caribbean tobacco strains to find a variety that would grow well in Virginia and appeal to English tastes. By 1613, he was one of Jamestown's more successful planters, and he'd noticed the prisoner being held at Henrico. He was attracted to her, and he convinced himself that marrying her would be a holy act of converting a savage soul to Christianity. Rolfe's letter to Thomas Dale, asking permission to marry Pocahontas, survives, and it's a masterpiece of self-serving rationalization. He writes about his internal struggle with being attracted to a native woman, his fear that this attraction might be sinful lust, and his ultimate conclusion that God wants him to marry her to save her soul. The letter is entirely about Rolfe's spiritual concerns and political calculations. Pocahontas appears in it only as an object, never as a person with her own desires or agency. At no point does Rolfe consider what she wants or whether she can meaningfully consent to marriage while being held hostage by his fellow citizens. Could Pocahontas have genuinely wanted to marry Rolfe? It's theoretically possible. Humans are capable of developing attachments even in coercive circumstances, and she'd been held captive for about a year when the marriage was arranged. She may have calculated that marriage offered better conditions than continued imprisonment. She may have been trying to broker peace between the English and her people. The intense religious indoctrination may have influenced her she'd been subjected to. But none of these possibilities changes the fundamental fact that she could not freely consent to marriage while being held prisoner. A captive cannot consent to their captor. That's not controversial or anachronistic moral reasoning. That's basic recognition of power dynamics. The marriage was arranged for April 1614. Powhatan didn't attend. He sent one of Pocahontas's brothers and an uncle as representatives, which English sources cited as approval, but more likely represented Powhatan's recognition of political reality. His daughter was in English hands. He couldn't rescue her militarily without risking wider war. Accepting the marriage was damage control, an attempt to salvage something from a bad situation. The wedding itself was performed in the English church at Jamestown with an appropriate Christian ceremony, and English propaganda immediately began selling it as a triumph of civilization over savagery, Christianity over paganism. But here's what the propaganda couldn't completely hide. Pocahontas's first husband, Kocoum, vanishes from the record around this time. Some sources suggest he was killed, possibly by the English, or possibly in the intertribal violence the English presence was generating. Others think he may have been forced to divorce her according to Powhatan custom, essentially discarded so the English marriage could proceed. Either way, his disappearance was necessary for the English narrative to work. They couldn't acknowledge that they were forcing a married woman into a new marriage, so they erased her Powhatan husband from the story. After the marriage, Pocahontas, now Rebecca, lived with Rolfe at his plantation. She gave birth to a son, Thomas, in 1615. English sources describe her as content, civilized, and a successful convert. They don't mention whether she had any contact with her Powhatan family during this period. They don't record her own words about her situation. They don't tell us whether she grieved for her first husband, whether she missed her father, whether she resented her captors, whether she felt any genuine affection for Rolfe, or was surviving as best she could in impossible circumstances. She exists in these records only as a symbol of successful colonization, not as a human being with an interior life. The marriage did create a temporary peace between the English and the Powhatan Confederacy, a period Virginia colonists called the Peace of Pocahontas. But this peace was built on hostage-taking and forced assimilation, and it only lasted as long as both sides found it helpful. For the English, the peace allowed them to consolidate their position, expand their tobacco cultivation, and increase immigration from England. For Powhatan, it was a temporary ceasefire while he calculated his next moves. Neither side had actually resolved the fundamental conflict. The English wanted land and resources that belonged to the Powhatan, and no marriage was going to reconcile those incompatible goals. In 1616, the Virginia Company decided to bring Pocahontas to England as a propaganda tool. They needed to attract new investors and settlers to Virginia, and what better advertisement than a converted Indian princess who proved that natives could be civilized and Christianized. They dressed her in English court fashion, prepared her to meet King James, and brought her across the Atlantic with a delegation that included Rolfe, their son Thomas, and about a dozen Powhatan people who were presented as her servants but functioned more as additional proof of successful colonization. The trip to England was a propaganda success. Pocahontas was presented at court, entertained by English nobility, painted by European artists in English clothing, looking almost entirely European except for slightly darker skin. The Virginia Company used her image to sell the Colonial project. Look, the savages can be saved, converted, made into proper Christians, and our venture in Virginia is a holy mission civilizing a dark continent. Wealthy English investors found this narrative compelling and increased funding for the colony. But there are cracks in the propaganda if you look closely. In London, Pocahontas encountered John Smith, whom she'd been told was dead. Smith recorded their meeting in his later writings, and even through his self-serving narrative, you can glimpse her anger. She reportedly called him father in a manner that Smith interpreted as affection. Still, it could just as easily have been bitter irony or a reference to the adoption ceremony that may have occurred years earlier. She reminded him that her people had welcomed the English, fed them when they were starving, and this is how the English repaid that kindness, by kidnapping her and making war on her father. The encounter was brief and seemed uncomfortable for both of them, and they never met again. Pocahontas spent about 7 months in England, on display for curious English audiences who wanted to see the famous Indian princess. She was probably sick for much of this time. European diseases that English bodies had adapted to were devastating to indigenous immune systems, and the cold, damp English climate was a harsh change froth a climate in Virginia. In March 1617, the Rolfe family prepared to return to Virginia. They boarded a ship and sailed down the Thames, but before they even reached the open ocean, Pocahontas became gravely ill. The boat docked at Gravesend, a port town east of London, and Pocahontas was taken ashore. She died there in March 1617. She was approximately 21 years old. English records say she died of a disease, probably tuberculosis or pneumonia. That might be true. It's also possible she was simply dying of despair, of the accumulated trauma of everything that had happened to her: kidnapping, forced conversion, coerced marriage, separation from her people, exhibition in a foreign land. The Powhatan believed that intense grief could kill, that a person's spirit could simply give up. Whether she died of European disease or a broken spirit or some combination of both, she died trying to return home. She was buried in the churchyard at Gravesend in a grave that no longer exists, as it was destroyed when the church was rebuilt in later years. Her exact burial site is unknown. Even in death, Pocahontas was denied connection to her homeland and her people. She died in exile and was buried in foreign soil, and her body has been lost to time. John Rolfe left their son Thomas in England with relatives, supposedly because the boy was too sick to travel, but possibly because Rolfe didn't want to deal with raising a mixed-race child in Virginia. Thomas would grow up English, educated in London, and wouldn't return to Virginia until he was a young man in the 1630s. Rolfe himself went back to Virginia, remarried an Englishwoman, and died in 1622, possibly killed in the Powhatan uprising that year when the Confederacy finally tried to drive out the English invaders once and for all. That uprising failed, and English retaliation was genocidal. They systematically destroyed Powhatan villages, burned crops, poisoned water supplies, and pursued a policy of extermination that decimated the Confederacy's population. By the 1640s, the Powhatan Confederacy was shattered, reduced to small remnant populations, pushed to marginal lands, their political power broken forever. The Peace of Pocahontas hadn't prevented this genocide. It had merely delayed it while giving the English time to become strong enough to commit it successfully. Now let's talk about what was done to Pocahontas's memory, because the lies didn't stop with her death. They evolved. Over the following centuries, English and American storytellers gradually transformed her from a kidnapping victim into a willing participant in her own cultural erasure. The coerced marriage to Rolfe became a love story. Her forced conversion became a spiritual awakening. Her exhibition in England became a diplomatic triumph. Her early death became a tragic but romantic ending, rather than the likely result of trauma and disease contracted during her captivity. This mythologization accelerated in the 19th century when Americans were looking for founding narratives that justified westward expansion and the displacement of indigenous peoples. The Pocahontas story was perfect for this purpose. It suggested that native peoples welcomed European colonization, willingly gave up their cultures to embrace Christian civilization, and that intermarriage could peacefully resolve the conflict between settlers and indigenous populations. It was a fantasy that made the genocidal reality of American expansion easier to swallow. By the time Disney made their animated film in 1995, the myth had entirely overtaken the reality. Disney's Pocahontas is an adult woman who meets John Smith as an equal and chooses to help him and his people, facilitating mutual understanding between cultures. The film includes 0 kidnapping, 0 coerced marriage, and 0 death in exile. It's not just historically inaccurate, it's a fundamental inversion of what actually happened. The story of a young girl being kidnapped and exploited by colonizers has been transformed into a story about that same girl freely choosing to help her colonizers. It's obscene, and people defend it. They say it's just a children's movie. It doesn't have to be historically accurate. It's meant to teach lessons about tolerance and understanding. But what lessons is it actually teaching? It's teaching that colonization was a two-sided misunderstanding rather than systematic violence. It's teaching that indigenous peoples welcomed or even facilitated their own displacement. It's teaching that a girl falling in love with her colonizer is romantic rather than tragic. These aren't innocent simplifications. They're dangerous lies that actively distort understanding of colonial violence and indigenous resistance. The real Pocahontas was never given a choice about any of it. She didn't choose to become a symbol of English colonial success. She didn't choose to be kidnapped. She didn't choose to be converted. She didn't choose her marriage, her voyage to England, or her death in exile. Choices were taken from her systematically and deliberately, and then her memory was exploited to justify taking choices from other indigenous peoples for centuries to come. Her name and image have been used to sell everything from cigarettes to theme parks. And through it all, the truth of her life has been buried deeper than her unmarked grave in Gravesend. Let's be specific about what we're describing here, because the language matters. What happened to Pocahontas was kidnapping, the forcible abduction of a person for ransom or other coercive purposes. It was human trafficking, the transport and exploitation of a person through force or coercion. It was likely sexual violence. There's no explicit evidence that Pocahontas was raped during her captivity, but given what we know about colonial violence against indigenous women, the absence of evidence in English sources that were actively trying to portray the colonizers positively doesn't mean it didn't happen. At a minimum, the forced marriage to Rolfe involved ongoing sexual contact that she could not meaningfully consent to while being held prisoner. And it was cultural genocide, the systematic attempt to destroy a person's cultural identity and replace it with the colonizer's culture. They took her name. They took her clothing. They took her religion. They took her language, her customs, her connection to her people and homeland. They tried to erase Matoaka and replace her with Rebecca, to erase the Powhatan woman and replace her with an English Christian. This is what cultural genocide looks like at the individual level. And what happened to Pocahontas was happening to indigenous peoples across the Americas on a massive scale. The Pocahontas myth serves a specific ideological function. It makes this violence look like a voluntary transformation. It turns genocide into a gift, invasion into an invitation, and exploitation into romance. And Americans keep telling this myth to themselves because confronting the truth is uncomfortable. It's easier to believe that Pocahontas loved John Smith and chose to bridge two cultures than to acknowledge that she was a child who was kidnapped, imprisoned, coerced into marriage, and died young in a foreign land trying to get home. But the people who Pocahontas descended from are still here. The Powhatan Confederacy's political structure was destroyed, but the Powhatan people survived. The Pamunkey and Mattapony tribes, both members of the original Confederacy, maintained state recognition in Virginia and continue to practice their cultural traditions despite centuries of attempted erasure. They remember their own version of Pocahontas' story, the one that doesn't make it into Disney movies. They remember her as Matoaka, a real girl who suffered real violence, not a cartoon princess who solved colonialism with love. When you visit Virginia today, you can see monuments to the Pocahontas myth everywhere. There's a statue of her at historic Jamestown, looking pensively into the distance, another in Gravesend near where she's believed to be buried, and paintings in the state capitol building depicting her marriage to Rolfe as a triumph of civilization. These monuments don't memorialize the real woman. They perpetuate the myth, their propaganda carved in stone and bronze, constantly telling the lie that colonization was beneficial and consensual rather than violent and coercive. The descendants of John Rolfe and Pocahontas, through their son Thomas, became prominent Virginia families. They include founding fathers and Confederate generals, wealthy plantation owners who enslaved African people while claiming descent from an Indian princess. The irony is extraordinary. People who benefited from slavery and indigenous displacement are claiming special status because their ancestors married a kidnapped indigenous woman. That's not a heritage to be proud of. That's a crime family legacy being whitewashed as romance. There's also the question of what Pocahontas' life tells us about early colonial sexual violence that English sources deliberately obscured. Indigenous women were systematically targeted for sexual assault by European colonizers across the Americas. This violence was both opportunistic, individual colonizers raping women they encountered, and systematic, a deliberate strategy of cultural destruction through forced reproduction and trauma. English sources from Virginia rarely mention this violence explicitly because acknowledging it would undermine the narrative of civilized Englishmen bringing order to savage wilderness. But the violence was constant and widespread, and Pocahontas' forced marriage to Rolfe should be understood in that context. When a colonial power kidnaps an indigenous girl, forces her to convert to their religion, dresses her in their clothes, and marries her to one of their men, that's not diplomacy or cultural exchange. That's sexual colonization, the literal possession of indigenous women's bodies as part of the larger project of possessing indigenous land. Pocahontas' body became a site of colonial conquest just as much as the James River Valley did. Her forced transformation from Matoaka to Rebecca symbolized what the English wanted to do to all of indigenous America: erase it and replace it with Englishness. And we need to talk about age because it matters. When Disney depicts Pocahontas as an adult woman who can freely choose to engage with John Smith romantically, they're erasing the fact that she was a child when the English arrived. The historical Pocahontas was 10, 11, or 12 years old during the period when she allegedly had contact with John Smith. Any suggestion of romance between them is describing an adult man and a child, and that's not romance, that's pedophilia. By aging up Pocahontas in their retelling, Disney and countless other versions of the story erase this uncomfortable truth and make the exploitation seem more acceptable. Even when the myth focuses on her marriage to Rolfe rather than Smith, it obscures her age and the power dynamics. She was approximately 17 when kidnapped, 18 when married, and 21 when she died. These are the ages when she should have been living with her people, raising her first child, learning the specialized knowledge passed from Powhatan mothers to daughters, and becoming an adult within her own culture. Instead, she spent those years as a prisoner, a convert, and a propaganda tool, dying in exile before she'd even reached what her people would consider full adulthood. The truth is that we don't really know who Pocahontas was as a person. We don't know what she thought about, what she loved, what she feared, what she hoped for. English sources only record her in relation to English purposes, and she never left any written record in her own words, at least none that survived. The Powhatan oral tradition likely preserved stories about her, but centuries of cultural suppression make it difficult to recover those narratives untainted by colonial influence. Pocahontas herself, Matoaka herself, the actual human girl who lived and suffered and died, is mostly lost to history. What survives is the myth, and the myth is a lie. So what do we do with this? We can't undo what happened to Pocahontas. We can't restore her life or her choices. We can't even definitively recover her true story because her captors and their descendants wrote the sources we have. But we can stop lying about it. We can stop teaching children that colonization was a romantic adventure. We can stop pretending that indigenous peoples welcomed or facilitated their own displacement. We can acknowledge that the Pocahontas story is fundamentally a story about violence against a young woman that Americans have spent 400 years trying to reframe as something beautiful. We can listen to the voices of the Powhatan people when they tell their own history, instead of assuming the English version is accurate or complete. We can acknowledge that Virginia was built on stolen land through systematic violence against the Powhatan Confederacy and other indigenous nations. We can recognize that the peace of Pocahontas was a brief pause in an ongoing genocide, not a successful model of cultural integration. We can understand that when we romanticize Pocahontas' story, we're participating in the same colonial mythology that justified centuries of violence against indigenous peoples. And we can teach the truth. We can tell children that yes, there was a girl named Matoaka, whom the English called Pocahontas, and she was kidnapped and used as a hostage, and what happened to her was wrong. We can explain that the Disney movie is entertaining but false, and the real history is darker and more critical. We can use Pocahontas' story not as a fairy tale about love conquering cultural differences, but as an example of how colonial powers exploited indigenous women and then lied about it for their own benefit. This isn't about condemning individual English colonists from 400 years ago, many of whom were themselves poor, desperate people trying to survive in a violent world. It's about understanding systems of power and how those systems operate through both physical violence and narrative control. The English didn't just take Powhatan land through military force. They took Powhatan history through narrative control, rewriting events to justify their own actions and erase indigenous resistance. Pocahontas' myth is a perfect example of this process, showing how colonizers transform their victims into willing participants, their violence into benevolence, their crimes into romance. The land where Pocahontas was born, where she played as a child, where she should have grown old and died among her own people, is now covered with cities and suburbs and highways. The Powhatan Confederacy's territory is now Richmond, Norfolk, and Virginia Beach, places where most people don't even know they're living on recently stolen land. The very erasure of indigenous history from the landscape is itself a form of ongoing colonial violence, telling indigenous peoples that they have no place in the modern world, that their history doesn't matter, that they should just accept their displacement and disappearance. But the Powhatan people haven't disappeared. They're still here, still maintaining their cultural practices, still passing down their histories, still fighting for recognition and respect. When they tell their version of Pocahontas' story, it's different from the Disney version. It's a story about a girl who was taken from her people, about a family that couldn't protect her from the colonial violence that was destroying their world, about a tragedy that symbolizes what colonization did to countless indigenous women across the Americas. That's the story that deserves to be remembered, not the sanitized fairy tale that makes Americans feel good about their country's origins. Pocahontas' grave in Gravesend remains unmarked, her exact burial location lost. There's a symbolic irony in that. Even in death, she couldn't return home, and now even her bones have been lost to history. But in another sense, she's everywhere in American culture. This mythologized version of her appearing constantly in everything from historical pageants to advertising campaigns. America took her image and memory, just like England took her body, and used both for its own purposes without regard for who she actually was or what she actually wanted. The violence done to Pocahontas didn't end with her death. It continues every time someone tells the romantic version of her story. Every time a child watches the Disney movie without learning the truth. Every time Americans use her name and image while ignoring the genocide her people suffered. That's the final cruelty. Pocahontas can't even die and be forgotten. She has to live on in distorted form, forever serving the purposes of the culture that destroyed her, forever being used to justify the unjustifiable. This is why the truth matters. This is why we have to be precise about what actually happened, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it ruins the pretty story we were taught as children. Pocahontas was kidnapped. She was forcibly converted. She was married to her captor's associate under conditions that made consent impossible. She was exhibited in England as proof of successful colonization. She died trying to return home. These are the facts, and they describe a crime, not a romance. The real lesson of Pocahontas' story isn't about building bridges between cultures or choosing love over fear. It's about what happens when one culture has the power to kidnap, convert, and exhibit people from another culture, and then has the additional power to rewrite that violence as beneficence. It's about how colonialism works, not just through guns and disease, but through narrative control, turning victims into volunteers and making the colonized complicit in their own destruction. It's about the importance of not letting the powerful control the story, of insisting on truth even when lies are more comfortable. 400 years after Pocahontas' death, we're still telling lies about her, still using her image to sell a sanitized version of American history that erases colonial violence and indigenous resistance. Every time we do that, we're completing the work her kidnappers started. We're finishing the cultural genocide they began. We're erasing Matoaka and replacing her with the myth of Pocahontas, just like the English tried to erase her Powhatan identity and replace her with Rebecca. We can't undo the past. We can't save Pocahontas, or restore her life, or give her back the choices that were stolen from her. But we can stop participating in the lie. We can tell the truth about what happened to her and what that tells us about colonial violence. We can acknowledge that Virginia and the United States were built on stolen land through systematic violence against indigenous peoples. We can recognize that the Pocahontas myth is propaganda, not history. And we can make sure that her real story, as much as we can recover it, is told honestly rather than buried under 4 centuries of romantic fantasy. Matoaka, daughter of Powhatan, lived approximately 21 years. She was kidnapped, imprisoned, forcibly converted, married off to her captor's associate, exhibited in a foreign land, and died in exile. She never chose any of it. And 400 years later, America still won't let her rest, still uses her name and image to sell the lie that colonization was beneficial and consensual. That's the real story. That's the truth Disney will never tell you. And that's why it needs to be told. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next episode, where we continue uncovering the hidden violence behind America's founding myths. Hit that like button if you appreciate history that tells the uncomfortable truths instead of comfortable lies. And drop a comment sharing your thoughts, because conversations about colonial history matter, and confronting the truth about our past is the first step toward doing better in the future. Thanks for watching.